fellow travelers to other worlds through books. My name is Mary O'Donnell, and welcome to my channel, Mary Reads to Live. Now, I want to warn you that this is going to get nerdy. This is a look into the genre of fantasy and how immersion influences the reader and how immersion is created in fantasy, especially because it is so important in fantasy, and I'm very fascinated by how immersion works and how authors use immersion and how they create that immersion in their works. And I also want to talk about the genre in a little bit deeper level and how that happens. How does immersion in fantasy happen, and how do authors create that, and how does it become something that is very unique? Immersion is something that, as I said before, is something some authors are really good at, some are not, and I think fantasy does it on a whole new level, and I think it's something very, very special to talk about and to kind of take a little bit of a deep dive into it. As I look into my favorite genres, fantasy, I remember hearing about it in school, but I never really, we didn't read it a lot, we didn't study it, it was more like if you want to read it on your own, you can, but that's not what we're going to study in school. For a long time, I thought, oh, okay, well, it's not worthy of study, right? It's nice, it's entertainment. But the further in my journey into fantasy that I have, and sci-fi too, that I've gotten, I found that there's a lot to be unpacked. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about is immersion, because immersion is one of the things that it happens for some people and it doesn't for others. And some authors are really good at it and some not as good at it. And so their plot has to drive the story. You know, people want to know what happens. Or some people have to be like really character driven. They have to get you really drawn into that character to get you immersed. So there's different ways to get immersed, and I wanted to talk about it because it's very interesting on many different levels how that happens. And if I'm looking down, it's because I have notes, because I'm an English teacher and I'm a nerd, so, I've got to have notes so I know what I'm talking about. So anyway, the different things about the fantasy genres, I had to learn a lot of it on my own. And the exposure I had was, independent reading, and what I saw on TV in the 80s, right? I'm an 80s child, and in the 80s there was a lot of fantasy. On television there was cartoons, a lot of cartoons were in fantasy, D&D was big, all of that stuff. So fantasy was in the discussion, but it wasn't something to be studied. It was actually something a little bit to be feared. And the youth, don't let your youth read too much fantasy or they're going to end up, depraved or something. It was really strange the way that they demonized fantasy and D&D at that time. After years of reading fantasy, I can finally now put into words my thoughts on how to study it, and I want to put this together to talk about what it is about fantasy that is so special and different, and what it brings to the literary table, because it does. It brings stuff to the literary table, and that's my opinion. Of course, this is all subjective, so don't take this as, law, but in my opinion, fantasy does bring something very special to the literary discussion. And one of the first things I want to talk about with this series is immersion. When we are immersed in a world that a author created, it is one of the most amazing feelings. And that is why I personally keep coming back to fantasy, because I can get so immersed in the world that has shaped the worlds and shaped the characters and the cultures that these characters come from. And so that's why I want to talk about immersion, and I want to talk about the two things that I think really affect immersion for me in fantasy. And one of those things is the world building itself and characters. The world building affects immersion in the way that if the world building is not strong, then of course you're not going to be able to be immersed. And if the world building isn't strong, then the characters are not going to have as much to react to when it comes to their cultural background. And if they don't have that cultural background, then those characters fall very flat. So what you have to have these different levels, these different cultures that see the world differently and that really shape the characters. They really take these characters and elevate their characterization through the world building. And the world building, it can be like in Lord of the Rings, we have the different races. We have the dwarves, we have the elves, we have humans, and different nations of humans, and they all see the world very differently. Even different types of elves, they all see the world very differently, and that is reflected in the way that they react to what's going on with Sauron and how they want to defeat Sauron, or if they're going to try to defeat Sauron, or if they're going to join with Sauron. Like, all their different cultures and their backgrounds really reflect that, because we have the hobbits. The hobbits are not, they're very isolated. They don't really get involved with the conflict of men and elves and other race dwellers and the other races. They kind of just have their own little isolated life, being farmers and gardeners or fishermen, whatever they're going to be doing. And they want a very simple life in the country. Their culture reflects that, because that's why it's so, there's tension there when Frodo ends up being involved in what's going on with Sauron and ends up with the ring and has to go on this journey, because his culture, this is not something that he should be doing. This is not something that he would wish to be doing in his own culture. Now, Frodo's a little bit different of a character. He kind of has that secret longing for an adventure, but he, in general, like, hobbits are not adventure seekers as a whole, but you have these, certain outliers like Bilbo and Frodo. But the fact that the hobbits, that there's a group of hobbits that are going to go with the one ring and go try to destroy it and have this big impact on the entire world and other races, is very different, right? It's not the way that their culture, it's not what they would be expected from the way that their culture it's run. And I love that. But I also love the fact that there's tension between the other characters, like Gimli the dwarf and Legolas. Sorry. And between Gimli the dwarf and Legolas the elf, and how they interact with each other. They're very competitive against each other. They don't really like each other or trust each other very much at the beginning. And that bond has to really build very slowly, because their cultures, elves and dwarves, don't really trust each other. They don't really like each other very much. They've had a lot of conflict. So that's a part of the immersion and part of that world building. And different areas of men have different views of good and evil. They have different views of Sauron himself and different views of what they should do to defeat Sauron. So I think that's very immersive, and I think that's how the world building and characters work together, have this wonderful blend that really creates an immersive experience and really brings both the world building and the characterizations together in a very well-rounded and beautiful way that is really hard for writers to accomplish, and very few writers have done that completely, and Tolkien is one of them. So that's why he's such a good example of immersion and using world building and characterization to reflect that in a beautiful way that is really amazing. So, and that's what the fantasy genre can really offer, is this sort of immersion that shows these different themes and these different things from our real world, but it's presented to us in such a way that it's more palatable and helps us kind of look at them with a different lens, so that we will look at them. There's some things in our world that we won't even look at because it's too hard to look at, but when we're reading and we're looking for these other characters, we can see that. We're able to deal with it a little easier. So that's one of the things that I think fantasy does very well. And I really enjoy that aspect, and I want to dive deeper into it as we look into fantasy. And one of the things is, let me know, what do you think? Do you think fantasy should be studied more at the literary, and with its literary elements, and more like it's like the other contemporary works and studied? Or do you think that maybe it should just be an entertainment? Or do you think it should be just more for entertainment, and that studying in that way would kind of like ruin the experience? So let me know what you think. I like deep dives into this, thinking about like what is it that makes these genres special, what makes these types of stories special. So let me know what you think, and I look forward to speaking with you in the comments. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, have an adventure with reading.